At 8 in the morning on the 26th of December, 1944, an American lieutenant stood at a second-floor window in an Italian village and watched German soldiers walking up the street below him. His name was John Fox. The village was Sommocolonia, a cluster of stone houses on a ridge above the Serchio River, and a few hours earlier it had been quiet, held by a thin Allied line. It was not quiet now. Through the dark, the enemy had come up the slopes and into the town, some of them in civilian clothes, and by 8 o'clock they were in the streets in strength, moving house to house. Most of the defenders had already pulled out. Fox had not. He was an artillery observer, the man who watches and tells the guns where to fire. And he had stayed behind, on the second floor of that house, with a radio and a few men, while the village filled with the enemy underneath him. He picked up the radio and called for fire. Then he called for it closer. And what happened in the next few minutes, what one man with a radio could do to the soldiers in that street, is the thing the German army would spend the rest of the war trying to answer, and never fully could. They could not stop it. They could not copy it. How could a single voice on a radio bring down that kind of fire, and why could the Americans do it when no one else could? The answer does not begin in Italy. It begins on a flat patch of Oklahoma prairie, more than 10 years before the war reached that street. And it ends back at that window. For most of military history, artillery had a problem that everybody lived with and nobody had solved. Guns were powerful, but they were slow and they were blind. Each battery fought its own private war. It fired at what its own officers could see, or at a map reference worked out by hand on its own gun line. And getting many batteries to land on the same place at the same moment was a matter of hours, telephone wire, and luck. In the First World War, men had died in their tens of thousands in the gap between spotting a target and getting the shells to it. At the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, in the early 1930s, a handful of officers decided that was a thing that could be fixed. The man who pushed first was named Carlos Brewer, the head of the Gunnery department, and his idea was almost insultingly simple. Stop making every battery solve the problem alone. Put one map in one room, let one team do the mathematics for all the guns at once, and let the gun crews just shoot. So they built the map. They threw out the old habit of aiming off hills and landmarks, fixed every gun's position by survey, marked it on a chart, and picked a single reference point on the ground, a base point that everyone measured from. In the spring of 1931, they proved it worked, massing a whole battalion, a dozen guns, off a single command. The next man to run the school, Major Orlando Ward, built the idea into a place with a deliberately dull name, the Fire Direction Center. Through the rest of the 30s, they sharpened it. A graphical firing table that collapsed a gunnery problem into seconds, a portable radio light enough to ride forward with the spotter. And by October of 1941, weeks before the United States was even in the war, the whole method was Army doctrine. Walk into that room and it does not look like a weapon. It looks like an accounting office in a tent. A big chart on a table, the gun positions and the base point pinned to it by survey. Men with protractors and slide rules and pre-computed sheets of firing data. No window on the war outside. The genius is in the plumbing, and the plumbing is this. The men in that center never saw the enemy at all. Forward, somewhere with a view, was the observer with his radio, and he talked only to the center. He never spoke to the guns. He did not have to know where the guns were, or how many there were, or what they were loaded with. He looked at the enemy and he said, in effect, there. The center took that one word and did the arithmetic for every gun on the chart at once. The range, the bearing, the climb of the shell, the corrections for the wind and the temperature of the powder, and, when there was time for it, the curve and the spin of the earth itself. And when there was not time, they threw some of those corrections away on purpose, trading a little accuracy for speed, because speed was the whole point. Each battery got its own numbers. The spotter's eyes, the center's mathematics, the gun crew's hands. 3 jobs, 1 nervous system. Put a clock on it, and you can see why it frightened people. A call comes in over the radio, a voice somewhere forward, low and fast, reporting a column of vehicles on a road. The man at the chart finds the spot, reads off the range and the bearing. Beside him, the others are already working. Sheets of pre-computed data, a slide rule, one set of numbers for each battery. The fine corrections folded in or thrown out depending on how much time the target is going to give them. A warning order goes down the line to the guns. And the guns, which never heard the observer, which cannot see the road, which do not even know what they are firing at, swing onto the numbers handed to them and fire. From the word in one man's mouth to the shells leaving the tubes had once been an afternoon of telephone calls and crossed fingers. Now it was a few minutes and getting shorter every year. The observer did not command the guns. He did not even have to know they existed. He only had to be seen by the room, and the room did the rest. What it meant on the ground is the whole story in a sentence. Before, a spotter who could see the enemy was only as useful as the one battery he happened to be wired to. After, that same spotter was speaking to all of them. He spoke, the center did the math, every gun in range turned and answered together. The guns no longer had to see anything. They only had to listen, one man's eyes, one man's voice, an entire battalion's fire. That is the machine that was really at the other end of John Fox's radio. Not a gun. A method. The Germans felt this method long before they understood it. And they felt it first as a matter of seconds. The Americans worked out a way of shooting they called time on target, and the name is exact. It did not mean fast. It meant together. The center could run the math so that shells from many guns, fired at different moments, from different fields, even from different battalions, all arrived over the target in the same few seconds. At its fullest, the technique could time the fire of 3 whole battalions to land in a single breath. The gunners worked by a rule that sounds almost like a joke. Silence is consent. Once a mission was called, it was coming. Only a voice telling them to stop could call it back. Why that is so much worse than ordinary shelling is a matter of human reflex. When the first shell lands, a soldier has a few seconds, no more than a handful, to throw himself into a hole before the rest come down. Those few seconds are the difference between a near miss and a funeral. Time on target takes them away. The warning and the killing blow become the same instant. The first thing you hear is everything, all at once, already on top of you. But the cruelest use of the method was not against men in the open. It was against the other side's guns. And here the system turned into a kind of hunt. Think about what it takes to kill a gun you cannot see. A German battery sits behind a hill, hidden miles back, and lobs its shells over the crest at you. You have never laid eyes on it. And yet the moment it fires, it gives itself away. The flash of the muzzle is caught by observers watching the horizon from a line of survey posts. The sound of the report rolls across a string of microphones planted in the ground, and the tiny differences in when each one hears it are timed to a fraction of a second. Cross the readings from several posts and the lines meet on one patch of earth. And that patch is the gun. Survey sections and sound ranges could pin a hidden battery to the ground in minutes, hand it to the fire direction center, and bring the whole weight of the method down on a target no one had ever seen. And the trap inside that is beautiful and merciless. The hidden gun can only be found when it fires. So, the German gunner faced a choice that was not a choice. Stay silent and be useless, or open fire and be located, and answered before his own shells had finished landing. The American way of shooting did not just outrange him. It punished him for shooting back. Then there were the eyes, and they did not have to be on the ground. One of the most feared things in the American arsenal was also one of the most absurd to look at. The L4, a little fabric-covered Piper Cub, a civilian puddle jumper with no armor and no guns puttering over the front at the speed of a fast bicycle. The pilot in that flimsy toy could see for miles, and the moment he saw, he could bring a battalion's fire down on what he was looking at. German tank crews learned to fear the slow little plane more than the bombers, because the bombers only carried what they carried, and the Cub carried the whole artillery behind it. One pilot even bolted bazookas to the wing struts of his Cub and went hunting tanks from a canvas airplane. The thing that was supposed only to watch had become a thing the German army had to watch for. By the winter of 1944, the Americans had even given the shells eyes of a kind. They fielded a fuse with a tiny radio transmitter in the nose of the shell that sensed the ground rushing up and burst in the air overhead, where there is no hole deep enough to hide. It had been kept secret for 2 years. fired only out at sea, where a dud would sink before the enemy could fish it up and copy it. Then, in the Ardennes, with the situation desperate enough, they turned it loose over land, bursting above men who had dug holes that no longer helped. Afterward, Patton called the new shell devastating, and at one crossing of the Sour he put his own blunt tally on a single action. Killed by actual count 702. And it was not only the guns that answered the radios. By the breakout from Normandy that summer, a general named Pete Quesada had put aircraft radios down inside the lead tanks of the armored columns, so a tank commander could talk straight to the fighter bombers above him and call them down in minutes. The eyes, the guns, and the planes all wired into one nervous system. And the whole thing ran on an unmistakably American premise. Better to waste 100 shells than to miss a single target with a supply line that could afford it. Now here is where the easy version of this story breaks. The easy version says the Germans thought the Americans had a secret machine. Radar-controlled guns. Artillery that aimed itself. You will hear it said that the enemy was simply baffled by some gadget. Go looking for a German who actually said that in the records, and you will not find him. What you find instead is something quieter and more damning. And the clearest place to watch it work is one bare hilltop in Normandy. The system was proving itself all over the war by then. At St. Lo, a single height, Hill 192, was taken apart under a 20-minute bombardment. 20,000 rounds from one division's guns falling on a single ridge. But to see what the system really was, to see it through the men who actually worked it, you have to go up onto a height above a French town called Mortain in August of 1944 and stay there for 5 days. After the Americans broke out of the hedgerows, Hitler ordered a counterstroke to cut them off. 4 panzer divisions thrown west to reach the sea. And the spearhead that drove into Mortain and up at the height above it was the 2nd SS, Das Reich. It came before dawn on the 7th of August, and it very nearly worked. But the German armoured troops who made it had fought in Normandy already, and they knew what to expect. As the sky lightened, they began to dig in because, as the American history of those days records it, the heavy American artillery fire already coming down on them told them the one thing they had hoped not to learn, that their surprise was gone. The attack rolled over and around a single American battalion and left about 700 men cut off and surrounded on a bare height the maps called Hill 314. And those cut-off men, with nothing but a view and a radio, pinned that entire SS Panzer division in place and would not let it move. Up on that hill were 2 artillery observers from the 230th Field Artillery, a lieutenant named Robert Weiss from Valparaiso, Indiana, and another named Charles Barts, and a few enlisted men with them. Their tools were simple: a spotting scope on a tripod and a 35-pound radio riding on a battery pack that weighed as much again. Their lifeline was a single phrase. When an observer called a target down to the fire direction center, the colonel who ran it, Louis Wieman, answered in 3 words that became the Hill's mantra for 5 days. On the way. It had begun the afternoon before the blow fell. On the 6th of August, a single German plane circled overhead, the first wrong note. By 4 o'clock, a sergeant named John Korn, scanning east through the scope, found a company of Germans marching up the road a mile off. Weiss called his first fire mission of the siege. The first salvo burst close, he adjusted, and when the dust cleared after the second, there were no signs of German life. That night, the SS came up the west side in the dark, screaming, and the fighting fell to grenades and bare hands. One of the men lay down flat on top of his own radio to muffle its hiss so it would not draw fire. By the second day, the hill was surrounded on every side. A German shell clipped the antenna clean off Weiss's radio. Another bounced off a rock beside him and went off harmlessly below. He wrote one line in his message log that day that would later give his memoir its title: Enemy North, South, East, and West. When the radio batteries began to die, and the radio was the entire reason for being up there, a 19-year-old corporal named Frank Denius learned to lay the dead batteries out in the sun, squeezing 6 more minutes of life from each one. In the dark, when German tanks rolled up a road the gunners had already measured, the men heard the engines first, then Weiss's voice on the radio, then the shells. The Germans, Denius said, must have decided the Americans could see in the dark. This was the system at its purest, and the regiment wrote down what it looked like from the inside. Anytime the Germans tried to mass and rush the hill in real strength, their own history records, the attempt was met with instantaneous fire from the guns. The observers up top radioing fire missions down to the center every 10 minutes, around the clock, day and night, for 6 days. Not a barrage that came and ended. A thing that was simply always there, the moment you moved, like a reflex that belonged to the hill itself. On the 4th day, 5 attacks were thrown back before 9 in the morning. When a convoy of German trucks unloaded its infantry in the open, 24 howitzers tore them apart before they could form up. The men on the hill were starving by then, scraping slivers of chocolate from ration tins, digging potatoes out of the fields, drinking soup that a few French villagers carried up to them under sniper fire. That evening, an SS officer climbed the hill under a white flag and told them what would happen if they stayed. Surrender before 8 o'clock, or be blown to bits. The man who took the message, Lieutenant Curley, of one of the cut-off rifle companies on the hill, refused it. He would not give the hill up, he said, until the last round and the last bayonet. The wounded men close enough to hear it cheered. 7 battalions of artillery laid a ring of fire around the hilltop that night, and the men slept, as one of them put it, with their hands on their guns. What they could not get was medicine. The wounded were dying, and the only road to them was a killing ground. The airdrops drifted into German hands. So the gunners reached the hill the one way left to them, with the guns. Late in the siege, they took smoke shells, the kind that burst to lay down a screen, emptied them, packed them instead with bandages and sulfur and morphine, and fired the medicine up onto the summit, an observer calling each one in over the radio. Half of it came apart in the firing, the morphine shattered, the bandages crushed to nothing. Some shells could not even be found in the dark until the men crept out for them at first light. But enough got through. The officer who wrote up the mission afterward ended his report with a line that reads almost like wonder. To the best of his knowledge, he said, it was the first time artillery had ever been used in this way. On the 6th morning, the 12th of August, the relief finally fought its way up the hill. Just before it arrived, Weiss climbed out of his slit trench to watch the Germans pull back. He had been out of it less than 5 minutes when a shell struck almost exactly where he had been lying, and caught Sergeant Korn, the man who had spotted the very first target 6 days before. Korn died quietly hours later. Of the more than 900 men who had been on Hill 314, only 376 walked down off it unwounded. And those 376, the regiment's own history says, were still holding at bay a vastly superior force when the relief came. The division was given a presidential unit citation for those 5 days. The honor did not arrive until 2020. That is the system, seen through the men who worked it. A few observers on a hilltop, a scope, a radio, and a sentence. On the way. Hold on to Robert Weiss for a moment, the observer who stood on that hill for 5 days and walked back down off it, because there was another man in another country doing exactly the same job who did not. The Germans were not fools, and they were not bad at artillery. So it is worth listening to what they concluded themselves, because they had been on the receiving end of this longer than anyone, going all the way back to the beachhead at Anzio in early 1944, months before D-Day. At Anzio, the Allies were pinned in a shallow beachhead, and the Germans came again and again to throw them into the sea. Each time, the attacks ran into a wall of shellfire. In one big push that February, they reckoned, by their own estimate, that they were outgunned something like 20-1, and their assaults, as one account put it, kept driving into a cul-de-sac of Allied artillery. The man who ran the staff for the German command in Italy, Colonel Siegfried Westphal, put his finger on the real trouble. It was not just that the Allies had more guns. It was that the Germans could not pull their own fire together the way the enemy could. They could not, he admitted, consistently coordinate the fire of the various arms into one crushing blow. And he summed the whole thing up in a sentence that could stand for the entire Western War. The blanket, he said, had gotten too thin. There is one more piece of German testimony worth holding up to the light, because of what it gets wrong. After Mortain, the German command had to explain the disaster to itself, and the explanation it reached for was the sky. Klug's own chief of staff wrote afterward that the great armored thrust had been wrecked almost entirely by Allied air power. It is a clean story, and the generals believed it. But when the Americans went out across that ground afterward and counted the dead German tanks, their own battlefield survey found something the generals had missed. Much of that armor had been killed not from the air, but by gunfire from the ground. The planes had taken much of the credit. The guns had done much of the work, and the men running the guns were a network the Germans never even saw. That is the answer, in the end. Not a secret machine. Not radar. The Germans were not fools about artillery. They had observation units of their own ways of hunting an enemy's guns. What they never built was the one room, the single place that owned every gun in range and could turn one man's report into all of that fire at once. And that is the thing you cannot steal. A gun you can capture, a fuse you can copy, an aircraft you can shoot down and take apart on a bench. What the Americans had was not a piece of equipment. It was the wiring between the pieces. And there is no version of that you can pull out of the mud and carry home. For all its rooms and charts and aircraft, the whole system came down in the end to one man, standing somewhere he could see. That man was the forward observer, and his was one of the strangest and most dangerous trades in the war. He worked ahead of his own infantry, sometimes a few hundred yards from the enemy, sometimes 20 miles from the guns he spoke for, and he carried nothing that could save him. A map, field glasses, a radio. His whole worth was his eyes and his voice. One trained man with that radio could move more killing power than a regiment of riflemen, which is exactly why the enemy hunted him first. To find the observer and kill him was to blind every gun behind him at once. What that trade actually felt like is caught in a single moment from the fighting around Mortain. Just after midnight in the dark, an American observer heard tank engines coming up a road and knew instantly that they were wrong. The motors did not sound like Sherman's. He checked. There was no American armor anywhere near that road. So he did the only thing his job allowed. He called the guns down on the sound, opening at 5,000 yards and walking the fire in, closer and closer to 1,000, onto a road full of German tanks he could hear but could barely see. One man awake in the dark with a radio, turning a noise into a battalion's fire. That was the job. And it was the job a lieutenant named John Fox had volunteered for, in an army that had spent years deciding men like him could not be trusted to do it. John Fox was born in Cincinnati in 1915. He went to Wilberforce University, took his commission as a lieutenant in the years just before the war, and was sent to the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Division, the only black infantry division the United States sent into combat in Europe. It was a segregated army, and the 92nd carried the whole weight of that. Its soldiers were trained apart, doubted in advance, and led at the top by a white commander, Edward Almond, who did not believe they belonged in the fight and never troubled to hide it. And the artillery, the proudest, most technical arm the army had, was exactly the place that doubt fell hardest. Fox was a forward observer, the same job Robert Weiss had done on Hill 314, calling for the 100 5mm howitzers of the 598th Field Artillery. On the rolls, he belonged to the cannon company of the 366th Infantry. He had spent 2 years learning the one thing the army least expected a man like him to be trusted with, to be the eyes the guns obey. In late December of 1944, the division held a stretch of the Serchio Valley in the mountains of northern Tuscany. Fox had volunteered to take an observer's post over Christmas, and on the 23rd he moved up into Sommocolonia and set up on the second floor of a house in the village. On Christmas night the enemy came. It was a winter offensive, a sharp punch down the valley by German mountain troops and the Italian fascist divisions still fighting for Mussolini, meant to throw the Americans back and prove the war in Italy was not yet finished. The blow that reached Sommocolonia came in the dark, and it came 2 ways at once. Some of the enemy had slipped into the houses overnight in civilian clothes, German troops, a few of them even passing as Italian partisans, while the Christmas watch was thin. The rest came up the slopes before dawn, and at 4 a.m, a company of German mountain troops walked straight into a minefield the Americans had quietly moved days earlier. Nearly 50 of them died in that single blast. It woke Fox, and when he reached his post at first light, he looked down and saw the streets already swarming. The village was held by about 95 men, some 70 American soldiers and 25 Italian partisans, local men fighting under a 23-year-old lieutenant who, like Fox, would not leave Sommocolonia alive. Most of the Americans were ordered to pull back. Fox was not most of them. That is the man who stayed on the second floor when the order came to go. Not a man the army had bet on. A man it had spent years betting against, standing at a window with the most powerful tool it owned, deciding what to do with it. By 8 o'clock that morning, John Fox understood two things. The Germans were in the streets in strength, and he was not going to get out. So he used the only thing he had. He could see, and he used what he could see to do the one thing the system allowed. He brought the fire in. Then he brought it closer. His battalion took the corrections off the radio and put the shells where he asked. "That was just where I wanted it," he told them. "Bring it in 60 yards. His commander came back on the line. The barrage was already heavy, it was too close, far too close. Fox sent his adjustment anyway, and the distance was cut in half. By some accounts, with the last handful of men who could still walk, American and partisan, trying to slip out of the town, he first called for smoke to cover them. What the record is certain of is what he did next. With the enemy thick in the streets below him, he turned the guns back onto his own position and called the fire down one more time, onto the spot where he was standing. "Fox, that will be on you," his commander said. The last thing they heard from him was this: "Fire it. There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell." When the Allies retook Sommocolonia a week later, they found Lieutenant Fox where he had fallen, beside his post. Around him, by the official count, lay the bodies of approximately 100 German soldiers. The fire he had called down on his own position broke the attack on that flank and bought the time the line needed to reform. Of the men who had held the village, only a handful reached the American lines alive. In one company, 17 of 60, Robert Weiss had stood on his hill for 5 days and walked down off it. John Fox stood at his window for one morning and did not. They never met, and they never knew each other's names, but they were the same kind of man doing the same impossible job. And that is the thing the easy story never quite gets right, because neither of them was ever alone. The voice on Fox's radio ran back down a wire to a center doing mathematics, and out to the guns and back more than a decade to a flat field in Oklahoma, where a few men decided that one set of eyes should be able to move an army's worth of fire. When John Fox called that last mission in, he was the last link in that chain. He was not a man shouting into the dark. He was a network. And on the morning of the 26th of December, he spent every link of it on the street below his window. For that, he received nothing for a very long time. The recommendation went in and went nowhere. It was not until 1982, 38 years later, that the Army gave his widow the Distinguished Service Cross. The Medal of Honor came in 1997, 52 years late. The village did not wait that long. In Sommocolonia, they raised a monument to 9 men, Lieutenant Fox and the 8 Italian partisans who died at their post beside him, and later opened a small peace park in his name, on the ground where he made his stand. We did not get any of this from a textbook. The words of Fox's last radio call come from his Medal of Honor citation. The 5 days on Hill 314 come from the men who lived them, and from the 30th Division's own records and the 120th Infantry's history. The count of Fox's enemy dead comes from the soldiers who walked back into Sommocolonia afterward and counted them. These were real units, full of men whose families are watching this now. The 92nd, the Buffalo Soldiers, the 30th, Old Hickory, the gunners of the 598th and the 230th Field Artillery. If one of them was yours, if you carry a name from these outfits, leave it below. That is how the chain stays unbroken.